Since 2007, Diary of a Wimpy Kid has been one of the best-selling book franchises worldwide. And here we are, 18 years and 19 books later. Number 20, Party Pooper. Now, I'm not going to go in depth on the history of this franchise. Personally, I'm ranking the series below Troubletown, but above Max Meow. Released on October 21st of 2025, just in time for the Christmas season, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Party Pooper would be a celebration of the franchise, with it being the 20th book and all, a fair-sized milestone, large enough to trip over. I randomly found this pre-release cover prediction from Reddit. It's unrelated, but it's pretty funny. As the name suggests, this is a birthday storyline, which is insane that we took this long to actually reach this point. If Greg was actually growing older each year, he'd be old enough to drink, drive, and cry over the fact he never owned a house of his own. Now, there's a reason I went out of my way to buy this book in specific shortly after it came out. That being, it's got one of the worst mistakes in the franchise that actually results in Greg having actual millions of dollars without him even realizing it. But I'll explain further once we reach that point. Right now, it's a good idea we understand the basic plot of the book. The story opens as all good stories do. This is a work of fiction. Greg is contemplating his previous birthdays and how he's made some poor on-the-spot wishes, like wishing for a stapler, which I don't see what's the problem here. I've encountered some pretty good staplers in my time. This wasn't an issue for him when he was younger. He always wanted these Viking warrior-looking guys called Colosso Men, but since Greg's mom thought they were too manly, she gets him these normal Bobs figures. We will be coming back to the normal Bobs. Anyway, Greg continues to ramble on about wishes and birthday cards for a while until we finally get to the actual plot, where due to the calendar being thrown out along with an old refrigerator, Greg's parents completely forget that it's his birthday and get absolutely roasted by the internet because of that. Internet doing the one thing it does best, I guess. Due to this, Greg is able to convince his parents to throw him a great big do-over birthday bash in his backyard, which goes just about as well as you'd expect a Diary of a Wimpy Kid birthday party to go. Absolutely destroyed by a deer, a wedding down the street, and Heath Healthy Body.
Then Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White.
At least the book ends on a high note, as Greg gets hired by the family of a kid whose birthday party Greg and Rowley crashed the previous year because apparently words got corrupted by when it reached the neighborhood over, and it was supposedly the greatest party ever. So suddenly Greg is being hired everywhere to host insane birthday parties. Now, if only this wouldn't be completely forgotten by the next book, only to never be brought up ever again. Overall, it's alright. I wouldn't call it incredible. In fact, more like so-so or a Mr. Mediocre guy. It's got a few moments that just don't make too much sense or mess with the flow of the book. And also Greg's parents being a lot dumber than usual. As crazy as that sounds. Manny and Roderick somehow barely appear throughout the entirety of the book as well. Still though, the book has that unmistakable Diary of a Wimpy Kid charm. However, and this is a big one, there is one major flaw that completely changes the entire future of Greg due to some of the poorest research I've encountered in a book of this level of prestige, and that being the entire B-plot. Nearly every Diary of a Wimpy Kid title has some kind of B-plot running in the background. We get introduced to it near the start, which brings me back to the normal Bobs. Specifically, a poster ad in a local comic book store looking for an older line of action figures known as the Normal Bobs. Now these Normal Bobs are exactly what they sound like, a line of normal human action figures styled after the 9-to-5 office crowd with accessories like laptops and stock options, sized somewhere around the 7-inch category. Basically exactly how one would imagine your average middle-aged office employee to look. Now that sounds like my kind of action figure, except they had one major design flaw, and that was the decision that they should, for some reason, start stinking up the room if you didn't wash them, you know, to add realism. Yeah, I don't know what this toy company was thinking either. From what I could gather, Greg doesn't mind the characters themselves too much. I mean, he did have that Barbie doll a while back, I shouldn't be too surprised. But due to them requiring regular washing to stop them from stinking up the entire place, his bedroom quickly goes from consumer plastic to Redditor basement pretty quickly, And so all the normal Bobs get yeeted into a box and sent off to the Goodwill to be incinerated. Unfortunately, Greg watches a movie where toys come to life, so Toy Story, gets paranoid on what his normal Bobs are thinking of him, and goes to the Goodwill and buys them all back. Of course, the exact same issue as before arises again, on top of Greg being convinced that the Bobs are judging him, so he gives them to Manny, who promptly tears them to pieces due to him being in a dinosaur phase. Which then leads us to our present time in the book, where Greg is at his local comic book store where he sees a poster ad looking for the normal Bobs. Inquiring about them with the comic book store guy, he finds out that the character Everyday Even, when new in packaging, is going for near $10,000 all of a sudden, which is crazy for Greg as he had 3 Everyday Evens. So when he gets back home, he thoroughly searches Manny's room, but all he can turn up is a single arm of Everyday Even. I suspect at some point Greg's mom must have gone through and thrown out all the dismembered remains of the normal Bobs. Now, this whole bit with the normal Bobs is actually a precursor to the real B-plot, which I'll get to right after I give you my thoughts on how feasible they actually are as a valuable collectible. I mean, I should know. I know a thing or two about collectibles and their values. As examples, look at this late release Thomas VHS, $100 easy. My CRT going up in value. My Super Treasure Hunts falling in value, except for the square body, interestingly. My uncorrected proof of Red's Planet, completely and utterly worthless. And with all that in mind, I actually think normal Bobs not only could have realistically existed, but also could legitimately be worth the insane value put on them. Now, before you start whacking me with plastic dollar store shovels, hear me out. We know that the normal Bobs were sold through some kind of educational toy store. There's a good chance that this would imply that the normal Bobs were coming from not the largest of manufacturers, perhaps a book publisher or school supply company taking a crack at a toy market. Because of this, there's a good chance they could only be purchased through specialty retailers, like an educational toy store chain, as a way to test how much of a market there would be for a product like this. And then we get to the stink. Now, it's a bit of a stretch to have an action figures that grow smelly and you have to wash them once or twice a week. However, it's not that there aren't toys out there that had an artificial stink to them. For example, Stink Blasters was a line of rubber figures from 2003 that would blast out stink when you squeeze them. They also got rebooted quite recently, so that's kind of an interesting fact. Anyway, so the idea of a figure that grows stinky over time is actually somewhat possible. Now, how water causes that stink to go away is beyond me. It makes me worry about what kind of chemicals might have been loaded into them, but I digress. This stink also absolutely would have helped to make them collectible, as an important part of a good collectible is a low supply of the item. Or you see, once you took them out of their packaging, boom, fart attack. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of kids got them on their birthday or for Christmas, only to instantly chuck it in the wheelie bin just for the stench alone. And for the exact same reason as Greg wanting to get rid of his, a lot of them most likely found their ways into the landfill. I'm actually surprised that Greg's local Goodwill would put the normal Bobs out on shelves with a stench like that. This would also explain why the sealed ones in specific are so valuable, as once you open it, again, death to the noses. The plastic packing most likely sealed in most, if not all of the smell. So to have it new in the packaging, being a collector, is quite literally the only logical way to have and display a collection of these normal Bobs. And now, even though all of this pretty much guarantees the eventual collectability, note how I said eventual right there, as something doesn't become collectible directly after it's released, at least not usually. There's kind of a valley of collectability. Here's a graph. We'll use this Fusetron Fuse as an example of a collectible item. So, up here is when it's first released. Lots of hype, everybody's buying. But right after everybody who wanted one has bought one, it drops dramatically. This can be gradual, but it's generally pretty quick due to most things intended to be collectible are released within a pretty short time window. So down it goes to the valley of everybody forgets about it. This is basically the point where everybody has it and generally gets rid of it. This phase usually lasts about 15 to 20 years. But right here, at the end of those years, you see a slow rise. And people begin to remember and be like, oh yeah, I had that as a kid. They have nostalgia for that product, driving the collectible back into the spotlight and the values into the stratosphere. Boom! our Fusetron fuse is now worth $2,000 a pop. So, for Greg, we know he had them as a kid. However, if he's currently between 14 and 15 as the wiki fandom page suggests, that hasn't really been enough time for the normal Bobs to have gone way up in value. However, even though Greg hasn't aged, his world around him has, as the technology in the series has advanced since the series release in 2007, or 2004 if you're a nerd.
Hello, Internet! Welcome to Book Theory! Is Greg Heffley really trapped in a time bubble?
I have 70 alternative accounts!
You parasites!
We do have something to possibly pinpoint when these normal Bobs are released, as Greg implies that he watched Toy Story shortly after he got them. Now, assuming he watched it in theater, and looking at the book series timeline, I'm gonna guess he had just watched Toy Story 3. As I really don't think Greg is talking about the 90s with Toy Story 1 and 2, and 4 being released in 2019 is not really enough time for normal Bobs to become the hot new vintage collectible. So with Greg having just watched Toy Story 3, this would put our Bobs at a release timeline of sometime between 2009 and early 2010. Which, given the story is set in 2025, that's just about the right time for something to suddenly become collectible out of nowhere. Especially in today's internet age. I mean, the odds that there were internet memes or TikTok videos that forced the normal Bobs into the spotlight is incredibly likely. I do think they could be older, but again, I wouldn't put them 90s old, as most 90s collectibles have already run their course, and we're currently on the 2000s hype train. So now, is it a $10,000 worthy collectible? Well, kinda. From my personal experience, there's a good chance that the $10,000 price might be coming from a small handful of eBay sellers that are overpricing their copies something insane. Realistically, they're probably actually selling for something closer to $6,000 or $7,000. As for loose examples, well, that really depends on how bad they actually smell, but if they're really as rare as they're made out to be, they could probably be fetching somewhere between $1 and $2K dollary dues. Even just the arm of Everyday Even that Greg found alone could potentially be worth something like $50 due to there probably being a fair-sized demand for replacement parts. Honestly, this bit, though I don't think intentionally written to work out as well as it did, is really good. It, for the most part, logically would make sense as a crazy overvalued hunk of plastic landfill. Good job, Jeff Kinney. However, this is not the real collectible of the story. In fact, this was just a precursor to the real B-plot. Allow me to introduce to you the Three-Eyed Feeble. We find Greg back at the comic book store, stocking up on comic books, when he finds the normal Bob's poster has been replaced with one for something called the Three-Eyed Feeble. Greg goes on to explain that his Feeble character is from a card game series called Micro Creatures, basically an exact knockoff of Pokemon, even had its own Pokemon Go moment called Micro Creatures Seekers. Now, the Feeble is basically our most basic character, your Greg Heffley universe equivalent to Magikarp. However, what the Feeble does not have is 3 eyes. Apparently, somehow the factory accidentally misprinted one of these cards with a 3rd eye, and now it's worth over 100,000 grand easy. In the meantime, Greg finds out that apparently there's a whole group of these collectors searching for his 3-eyed Feeble, and they've narrowed it down to only a handful of locations where this card could show up, which includes the one comic book store. And since Greg is having his birthday do-over party in a short while, he creates a bunch of party invitations that require everybody who shows up to bring him a pack of cards. But when the party rolls around, apparently this collectors group caught wind of it and were rooting through Greg's presents looking for the packs. They themselves, though, are sent packing by a rogue child with a baseball bat. Shortly after, party implodes on itself, a lot of presents get destroyed, and everybody packs up and walks out, taking all the cake with them. Greg, after cleaning up the mess and eating assorted cheeses, heads up to his room and finds a card left by his aunt. And well, what do you know, there's a Micro Creatures card pack in there. Greg instantly opens it because the book is nearly done and he knows that this is supposed to be the final plot twist or something, and finds the 3-eyed Feeble inside. Now, from here, Greg holds on to it for a little over a week, and since nobody else in the Micro Creatures underworld knows he has it, the price has continued to climb to an estimated $1 million. This in itself takes a toll on Greg's mental health, and since Manny, that horrible little alligator monster child, can sense something's up, and it doesn't take long for him to get a hold of it and ruin the card by turning the Thibault into a kindergarten art project. I wouldn't completely blame Manny though. Greg did hide it under Manny's own mattress, and I wouldn't put it past that kid to be the kind to feel a single pee under 100 mattresses. Right after all this happens, Greg decides just to see if he can sell it off at the comic store, even in its fairly ruined state. Well, as it turns out, Microcreatures themselves got a wind of all of this nonsense and created a line containing exclusively three-eyed Thiebbles, so everybody can now own one. And well, they messed up all the cards as they somehow gave them all 0 health, making them basically unusable in battle. And that's where it ends. From here, Greg just says he's not happy that he got swept up in the Microcreatures craze and moves on. Respectable. The book never tells us what Greg wound up doing with the card, but seeing as the book never says he sold it nor threw it away, I suspect he just packed it away in his binder with the rest of his cards. But see, here's the thing. Because of this, Greg is still a millionaire. And for the simplest reason too. I said Microcreatures flooded the market with official three-eyed Thiebble cards, making the original impossible to tell apart. However, you can super easily tell them apart, seeing as you can actually play the original card in a deck. The new ones have 0 health, but original error card has 2 health. Sure, it doesn't make a big difference, but 0 times literally anything is still 0, no matter what you try. If anything, this makes the original even more valuable. And the funniest part is, this isn't even the worst discrepancy. In fact, there's literally no way Greg, or anybody for that matter, should have even known that this card exists. For this whole portion of the book was done with pretty much 0 research into how the Pokemon card collectability and resale market works. And I should know, I've worked for 2 different large retailers of collectible trading cards myself.
They both closed.
On a related note, there was a physical three-eyed Thiebble cards that you'd get with the book if you bought it from Target or Kohl's, with the exception of Canada, in which case it's an Indigo Chapters exclusive. Unfortunately, I bought mine from Toys R Us right before they turned it into another Spirit Halloween, so I don't have the card. Let's start right back at the very beginning, that being the misprint of the Thiebble. Misprints and error cards happen all the time, from such things as wrong colored ink being used, or ink smears, to incorrectly cut cards making weird shapes. Holographic layers put on incorrectly, even mismatched fronts to backs happen from time to time. What does not happen is one extra eye on a character. If you take just a moment to think about how these would be made, they're printed off in mass, cut, glued together, and packaged. How does one single card wind up having a third eye perfectly in the center of its forehead between its other eyes? Do they just have a machine that exclusively prints eyes, separate of the rest of the printing process, that somehow misaligned and misprinted exclusively one of the most common cards in the entire Microcreatures lineup, and then proceeded to get past quality control? Like, it's not completely unusual for printer errors to happen, but that's usually just because Jeff in the product design accidentally left one of the layers in Krita on when he shouldn't have, and so a whole batch gets ruined until somebody on the line notices that we do in circles now suddenly. But this card here was already in production for a while at this point, and suddenly here comes out one card that's completely different from every other card. Literally, the only possible explanation for this would be that this was supposed to be a massive marketing stunt by Microcreatures. However, if this were true, then first off, Microcreatures would have been more aware of this whole phenomenon much earlier on. And secondly, that would mean they'd have had an official three-eyed Thiebble card ready to release as soon as the error one was found. Which is just a hair away from being the case. Except they obviously didn't, because the card they officially released had its own major error of having 0 health. So there was literally no way for them having planned this to happen, which leads me on to my second major plot hole. So we know for certain this whole Microcreatures brand is basically the in-universe equivalent to Pokemon. It has Pokemon Go, Microcreatures Seekers, holographic cards, and a past of being popular trading items at schools to prove it. Also, it implies that Neurobobs might actually be late 90s, as Pokemon originally came to the Americas in 99, which coincides with Toy Story 2 release date, which might actually mean that Greg Heffley is somewhere in his 30s. But that's not something I want to wrap my brain around right now. For you see, This leads to our three-eyed Feeble Hunters, who apparently have enough information to guarantee that this card will show up at exactly one of only 4 stores in the entirety of the United States of American Freedom and Alberta, all within a short distance of each other. How could they have this knowledge? Simple. They shouldn't. The only logical explanation is that somehow, someway, somebody inside the factory actually saw this one single card that was somehow printed with one extra eye in a sea of near identical cards before the cards were packaged, somehow knew exactly where these boxes were being shipped across the globe from their factory in China, and from there decided to up and tell the whole internet. Now, if this was Pokemon, well, this would never happen, for a number of reasons. Any company puts in a lot of time to make sure these things don't happen in the first place, because a leak like this could really help a competitor, ruin your image, and worst of all, affect your company's share prices. So how this could happen without them somehow knowing for weeks, mind you, the literal leaking of delivery data on where cases would be shipping out to from the factory floor is near impossible. I'm not even sure if you can even per se track that, due to how many distribution chains and warehouses pretty much any product has to go through. The amount of insider knowledge you'd have to leak this is simply too much. Also doesn't help that this info would most likely be leaking from China, so to know all of that and get passed through the language and internet restrictions barriers is yet another nail in the coffin for this whole plot line. Despite all of this, Greg manages to get it. And that's despite this already having been made public knowledge. How that comic book shop had any card packs even left by when Greg's birthday rolled around is a mystery in its own right, considering how bad scalpers are these days, and on top of that, the collectors, which likely already had money by when this was all dropped, most likely completely emptied every store on their list themselves. Ignoring everything I've just said though, Greg has it and brings it into the comic store to hopefully sell it to them, which is the third and final eviction notice in the plot hole mailbox. What is Greg doing trying to sell $1 million card at a regular comic book store? This isn't something you can just walk in and expect them to hand you $1 million for, and this should be obvious. Greg was looking up info on the microcreatures online, so there's no way he doesn't even know that this kind of stuff can only really be sold online on places like eBay. It's not like the comic store has enough dough just lying around, waiting for when somebody walks in with a game card the value of a small house in Ontario. I mean, at least for the normal bobs, while maybe not being able to take in a new one at $10K, the store can probably offer a fair-sized chunk of change to Greg if he walked in with an intact everyday even. But this is something but everyday. And the fact that it was ruined by Manny wouldn't subtract from its value, at least not in the hugest way, as even in its current shape, it's still a 1 of 1. I mean, the Colosseum is 1 of 1, and I don't see whoever owns it actively trying to throw it away. Also, it's drawn on with marker, which can be permanent, but this is the Heffley household. If they had permanent markers lying around, there's no way every wall in their house wouldn't have turned into a modern art exhibit. Greg's parents are smart enough to know that. Or maybe not, I don't know, their mental health has been on a decline since the mid-2010s. Anyway, suffice to say, any potential buyer would intend to get it cleaned up, whether that be for display or to be sold for an even higher price at a major auction. In fact, if Greg wanted to sell it, he'd first have to get it officially graded. Sure, it'd get one of the lowest gradings possible, but at least it'd prove its authenticity. And from there, it'd be simply a matter of either putting it up at a nice 1 mil on eBay, or putting it up for auction and shooting for the ceiling. A bit of a hassle for certain, but at the end of it, Craig would be the richest kid on his block. And as long as he has that card, well, he technically already is. So, in summary, Greg is secretly a millionaire due to getting a card that should be impossible to get, all because of bad writing. Does this ruin the book? Well, for me, yes, it's a horrendous crime. I lived and worked through this in real life, it's been my longtime hobby, and I'm ranting about it right here, right now because of it. But otherwise, I mean, it's alright. This is not something that completely takes you out of it, especially on the first read through. It's more like a, if you think about this too hard, it falls apart type deal. Though, again, Manny and Roderick are barely existent, and Rowley is still playing background, so honestly, it's up to you. I'd rate the book a solid 5.6 out of 10, right in D tier. It's no masterpiece by any means, but you know, it can always be worse. Thank you for making it to the end of the cool graph. Just so you know, at 100k subscribers, I'm buying the original Blendtec blender and blending a whole bunch of random things. Also, $1 a month on Patreon, and you get to watch me yell over whatever objects people are throwing at Goodwill staff these days. That's all. Be nice to retail employees. Bye!